Hello, Christina. My name is Alexandra Goff. I will be doing my presentation today over my research paper. So because I'm not the best at presentations, I'll be going through it as a checklist almost, through all of the terms that we had to define. It's kind of how I structured my paper. So just if that gets a little confusing, that's what I'm doing. So I titled my paper, "The Problem with the Feathered Headband." They're doing a little bit of research about it. It just seemed kind of appropriate. It's really easy to misappropriate a culture like this, and it was pretty fascinating getting to learn about it a little more, especially through the textbook. So when I read the textbook, like going back through when you have to do a paper, you kind of get a little more involved with it. So I started my paper talking about this fascination that the American society has always had with Native Americans. And obviously it's had its ups and downs, but this has really changed and shaped how they've been viewed in society. And the media has been a huge part of that, but even before music and before the media, I think that the way some of our conventional practices in America have a huge effect on how we see it, because we have this white Protestant, typical American family viewpoint that we're trying to strive towards. We feel like there are roots, and that, got really deeply developed in, the 1900s, and right around when a lot of this violence toward Native Americans has come about. And so, specifically talking about these practices, well, when children grow up in our education system, they're taught this whites versus Indians thing in very innocently seeming activities. You have them playing the games like the Cowboys versus Indians, and then singing all of the songs, dressing up with the feathered headbands and all of that. Things that seem really innocent at the time is actually really showing kids that there's this barrier, there's this dividing line between Indians and Native American people and that typical American family. So it's really sinking in how they are different. I think when we get into where discrimination really comes into play, is a good time to bring in the music and the film and the performance aspect of society and how that shaped how we view Native American culture, because that the entertainment industry had it still does, but even back then, even when it was first becoming popular, it had such a huge pull on people's opinions and viewpoints about subjects, because everybody just wanted to know what everybody else knew, and they wanted to fit in and have the same beliefs as the majority did. And something that I did not know existed until researching this was when we talk about the blackface minstrelsy, I think is how you say it. But I knew about blackface. I did not know that there was a group of traveling musicians that made a show out of, a comedy show, out of discriminating against African American people by painting their face black. And I think that isn't shocking, really. It should be surprising, but it's not. But I think that they hid that racism and that, hatred in entertainment. And I think that happens often, especially with the Native American culture throughout the past, specifically 100 years. When we talk about singing red face, it's essentially, anything that's somebody acting or pretending to be an Indian when they're obviously not of that culture. I think it's very similar to the blackface phenomenon that happened. I chose the Peter Pan song, the "What Makes a Red Man Red," from the book, just because I felt it was significant because it's a child's film, and I think that was a huge part of what I found fascinating about the research, was how big it was in kids shows and how big teaching children about this was to us, and I guess still is. But it was the pretty typical, throw in all of the stereotypes about Indians. So they had the feathered headdress, the moccasins on, and then they gave them all of the children, all of the Lost Boys, Wendy and Peter Pan, had the little feathered headband so they could be Indians. And this is just another example of that playing Indian thing that's so popular for children to do. Something that I mention quite a few times actually is how that, like, those roots of the white Christian typical American family kind of plays into this. I do think religion was a big part of it, but even keeping religion out of it, I think that everybody just wanted to stay in their comfort zone. And it was easy to make like Native Americans a scapegoat for, something that was going against their typical way of living. And something that kind of plays into this when we talk about performance and like film specifically was Western films, and how, they became popular because they were like a good guy versus a bad guy. And it may not have, been supposedly portrayed like that on purpose initially. And there might have been more complexity to it, when you actually watch the films. I don't know if I've ever actually seen one, but I know that it played this, the family man cowboy, okay, and he's fighting against the Indian that's supposed to be this savage that you're supposed to fear, or hate, or either way. And I think through this act of red face too, when they portray Indians like this is where that racial antipathy comes from. And this is where, instead of, kind of maybe wanting to understand the culture a little bit more, we just jumped to straight hatred for a culture. And then we got angry about it. And like I said, we used them as a scapegoat, for our persecution, as just like white Protestant Americans. And that, I think, is where a lot of the actual physical violence came in. And then on the other side of things, we have that idealized sympathy, which is another really fascinating concept, just because, initially you think, okay, well, there's two sides. There's if you're racist, but then you have the sympathizers, and they're compassionate, and they really care for culture. But really, there's a lot of ignorance towards that, which is what makes it idealized sympathy, because they're not sympathizing another human. They're not looking at those Native American people like that they're equals and that they just want to protect them just for the sake of being good. I think it's more they're victimizing them, and they're playing into that stereotype where they're savages and they don't know any better, and they're like, we'll protect them because they're not as sophisticated as us, and we need to make them more like us, which is where it's bad. So then we get into cultural misappropriation. And I think it's first important to understand cultural appropriation. I think that this concept is commonly misconstrued, and people just kind of have a negative thought process when we say cultural appropriation, when really it's neither bad or good. It's just taking something from another culture and incorporating it into your own. So we do that with languages, we do it with food, with tangible items, we do it with religion, ways of living, like all of those kind of things. So I think that is common. But when we get into cultural misappropriation, that is where the bad comes in. That is where, it's not about you taking something from another culture. It's about what that culture then represents to you in your own home. So for my example for this, I use the debate over having an Indian mascot, and I think this is a really good example because some initially they argued that well, they're it's a respect thing. They're impressive and they're warriors. That's what we want to represent us. When in reality, I think that it more symbolizes that savage Indian. Fear us. We're ruthless. We're vicious, which is exactly what Native Americans were trying to get away from. So lastly, I talked about cultural confusion, which kind of continues that discussion of ignorance. It's just when people, they don't know any better because of all of the misinformation and the stereotypes that are out there. It's really easy to only know the bad parts about, a certain culture, or only know that misinformation, or not know anything at all, which is why I think it's so important that all of these modern artists right now are kind of incorporating their culture into their music and showing people, making them aware that there's so much more to the culture than people think. So it's not just about like bringing new information, because it's so much more than that. It's more about changing the previous ways that we already think so that we can kind of make room for that new information.